Most important names in college football. We did 5 of them already the other night. I want to get to another 5 of them tonight. And these are names that basically are going to impact their program, but also they're going to have a bigger ripple effect on the rest of the sport. And one of them is Spencer Rattler, and I kind of forgot to mention him the other night. He probably belongs in the top 5, not just because of what he can do at South Carolina this year, but I think of what it signifies in December. Kind of take the visual tour with me for a second. Imagine this, if you will. If you think South Carolina is going to go 5-7, ignore the next 30 or 45 seconds. But if you're open to imagine with me for a second, it's December. We've wrapped up the regular season, and all of a sudden we realize it wasn't Kentucky, it wasn't Florida, it wasn't Tennessee. What if South Carolina ended up being that team that challenged Georgia in the East? What if South Carolina ended up being the next most viable candidate over there? And what if it was because of Spencer Rattler? And what if he drug those receivers a little bit higher on the postseason awards list than you thought they were capable of? And what if, just as a collective, Marshawn Lloyd looks good at running back? And what if offensively they do even a little bit more in year 2 than you thought they could under Shane Beamer? And it's because of Spencer Rattler. Of course, that'll get South Carolina a lot of attention, as it should. And of course, it will pay huge dividends for them in recruiting, both high school and the portal, as it should. But I want you to also think about this. This may matter to you, it may not. But don't forget, when Spencer Rattler came to South Carolina by way of Oklahoma, he didn't come with his mouth shut. He had some comments. Now, he didn't go seek the nearest microphone out, but when people asked him, he talked about how, I feel like I'm being developed better here. I feel like I've already learned more here than I did the time that I spent at Oklahoma, rather. Were those shots at his former staff? Yeah. Did he have the greatest of experiences at Oklahoma? No. Might he have brought some of that on himself? Yeah. I'm not here to defend him. But what I am here to ask you is, if, after him saying all that, he ends up playing at a higher level than you've seen him play under a new staff, what would it lead to? Well, I can promise you what it would lead to. It would lead to a lot of articles in December, and they would be titled something to the effect of, was Spencer Rattler right about Lincoln Riley? Now I want you to imagine, and this is where it really gets hairy. What if USC on the West Coast has not lived up to expectation? And so you've got not only that headline, but then you got the sub-headline of Spencer Rattler leads South Carolina to new heights as his former head coach and quarterback who replaced him at Oklahoma falter on the West Coast. That's the storyline crowd would eat that up. It doesn't so much matter because what South Carolina does not really impact what USC does, only in headlines and only on Twitter. But real talk, it would seriously impact the future of the SEC East, not only for what they could do this year, but South Carolina would be able to just package that entire reality up and sell it forever in recruiting. They would no longer hurt for proof of product and proof of performance. They would have that to show future prospects. At Utah, Kyle Whittingham, his name belongs on this list, the head coach out there at Utah. One of the longest tenured, I guess that's redundant, one of the most tenured head coaches in college football now is Kyle Whittingham. He's been out there forever. He is 144-70 overall at Utah. What might his name be on this list for, you ask? Well, consider where the Pac-12's headed. This is what I talk about with Utah before I even zoom in on them. If you're Alabama, if you're LSU or Ohio State, you can think about 2022 and it's just 2022. Because the Big Ten and the SEC are always just going to be there and you don't have to worry about that. At Utah, you don't know what the Pac-12 is going to be in the future. So for all you know, this is as legitimate as your conference will appear on the national landscape for the foreseeable future. You got to take advantage of it because a lot of that stuff's out of your hands. But everything that happens in 2022, it's going to be in your hands. Utah could make the playoff this year. They have the capability. They have the schedule. We don't have to worry about that. They have the team. They showed how they got hot last year with a lot of these same pieces. They have everything you would need from kind of an intangible and motivation standpoint because they saw what they could be kind of down the stretch last year. They end up going to the Rose Bowl. They had some injuries there. They end up fighting but losing to Ohio State. But they've got the team to do it this year. And if Kyle Whittingham's able to do that, Kyle Whittingham, this is not the part Utah fans want to hear. Kyle Whittingham would be the first candidate. He would be the first arrival at a table of conversation that's going to be brand new. And that table of conversation sounds like this. Kyle Whittingham and Utah are a current Pac-12 team. This is in futuristic imaginary land, where they've, let's say, won the Pac-12 and Utah goes to the playoff. Here's how it would sound if that happened. Kyle Whittingham just did the most at Utah that we think he could ever do. Does he want to stay at Utah, or does he want to take an opportunity to go to more solid footing in places where he would no doubt have job opportunities? I mean, if anyone got the slightest inclination that Kyle Whittingham was willing to leave Utah, he'd have a ton of job offers. It's just that no one has ever thought he's going to leave. He may not leave, but the conversation will sound like that. It'll be, all right, you just won out there in the Pac-12. You better get out of there while you can, because that conference is sinking under your feet. And unlike a lot of the folks out there, you've got value. The conference doesn't, but you do. As a coach, you have value. Are you going to get out of there, or are you going to stay on a sinking ship? That's what the conversation would sound like. Is it fair? No. But that's what the conversation would sound like anyway. That's why Kyle Whittingham is a really important name this year, because he would be the first, theoretically, but not the last guy who dealt with that kind of conversation. Had Mario stayed at Oregon, he'd be dealing with it. If Dan Lanning has a good year this year, he'll be dealing with it. Lincoln Riley's not, because USC has already made their future intentions clear. But a lot of the folks, I mean, Brent Venables well, no, he won't, because he's going to the SEC. Dave Aranda will deal with this at Baylor. Mike Gundy will deal with this at Oklahoma State. So just keep an eye on Kyle Whittingham. Tyler Van Dyke, the quarterback at Miami, absolutely belongs on this list. He's one of the most important names in college football this year. How important is he? Well, I guess the best comparison would be to go right back to his conference 1 year ago, look at Pitt, the eventual ACC champ last year, and ask yourself, how important was Kenny Pickett to them? Because Pitt football was Pitt football. You just happen to have a first-round draft pick at quarterback playing for Pitt football last year. And they ended up being a double-digit win team, and that's exactly what the difference could be this year with Miami. You could have what has been Miami around Tyler Van Dyke. And if Tyler Van Dyke plays at that kind of level this year, that's the kind of stuff that takes you from a 7-5, 8-4 caliber team to a 10-win caliber team. And if Miami's a 10-win caliber team this year, they are no doubt, at the very least, in the conference title picture. They're probably in the conference title game. And I don't think I need to remind you what happens. If you've got a hot and very talented quarterback in December, anything can happen. Nothing is off the table for you. And if you've followed recruiting and you understand the talent makeup and the talent roster makeup at Miami, this is not a start over. It's not a rebuild project from the ground up that Mario Cristobal's inherited down there. If you look up and down the roster, I mean, running back, they got a really good 1-2 combination at running back. They've got a lot of continuity, to say the least, on the offensive line. They don't have just this complete lost project that you look at when the new coaching staff comes in and says, 2 years from now, if we're lucky, he'll have this thing back on the track. Because of what they inherited, they could be right there this year. Their 2022 schedule opens up very favorable for them, I think, because they've got a couple of very winnable out-of-conference games. Then they go to Texas A&M, which is also an out-of-conference game. But after that, they come home, they got Middle Tennessee, and then they open conference play on the 8th of October at home versus North Carolina. And if you just look up and down the schedule, imagine yourself with a Tyler Van Dyke fulfilling expectations. North Carolina, at Virginia Tech, Duke, at Virginia, Florida State, at Georgia Tech, at Clemson, Pitt. Where's the unwinnable game? I'm counting at Clemson there. If you're going to Clemson, maybe you've got the better quarterback. If things haven't panned out with DJ, I imagine we see Cade Klubnik by then, but you may take the better quarterback in there. You ended up doing it last year at Pitt, so you may do it this year at Miami. Tyler Van Dyke will be a critical piece in that ACC race. For the future of Miami, that's understood. But for the future of Miami recruiting, and then also this year's ACC title race, yeah, it's a really important name. This name you may not know, Eric Wolford. How many of you know who that is? That is Alabama's offensive line coach this year. I didn't even just want to single out an offensive lineman. I wanted to go with the O-line coach. They had Doug Marrone there last year. And here's where college football gets kind of hard to figure out. You might have thought, looking at Nick Saban bring in a former NFL head coach in Doug Marrone to be his offensive line coach, you think, wow, Bama's offensive line is just going to be dominant. Because automatically, if a guy's qualified to run an entire NFL team, certainly he can put together an incredible college offensive line. Well, I wasn't there last year, so I'm not going to sit here and recount what went right, what went wrong with Alabama's offensive line. I'll tell you one thing that went wrong is they had to replace 3 really, really good players that went to the NFL. And the other thing is you may or may not have had a guy that was a great fit there. And one of the pieces of evidence that I would present to you is he's not there anymore. And that's usually a pretty good one to pull out. Usually gives you a pretty good idea of what happened and what didn't happen. Eric Wolford is there now. And Eric Wolford is one of the most important names in college football because if I tell you Bama's going to have a good offensive line this year, they become an even greater favorite to win it all. They're already the favorite. But right now they're a favorite with a question mark next to offensive line. Because is Tyler Steen going to be a plug-and-play left tackle for them, the transfer from Vanderbilt? You would think so, maybe. Is J.C. Latham, former 5-star offensive tackle, is he going to just seamlessly pan out at right tackle? Bama fans think so. You would hope so in their case. I don't know that. But if I did know that, I'd pick them right now to win the national championship. As it stands, I still may pick them to win the national championship. It's a really, really good team. But Eric Wolford, if his unit does not pan out, that'll probably be the reason Bama doesn't win it all. If they fail to win it all this year, I guarantee you, unless you've had an injury to Bryce or something like that at quarterback that just changed the complexion of the team entirely, if they're not watching the confetti rain down on them in January, where are we? L.A., I think, this year for the national title game. If they're not out in L.A. Winning the national title and you're trying to figure out why, offensive line has probably been why. Lastly, we're going to go 2 names here, but it counts really for one team. Sharon Moore, Matt Weiss, those are the names, co-offensive coordinators, taking over for the departed Josh Gaddis at Michigan. The more I look at Michigan, the more I get excited about Michigan. You know, it would be very easy if you didn't pay attention to players and you just went with the storyline soap opera aspect of the sport, which is fun, to say that Jim Harbaugh almost left and then he didn't leave, but man, this is going to be Dan Mullen 2.0. Never gets checked back in and team struggles this year. If you know anything about Michigan, you know that's a far cry from what reality is there. And secondly, I think it's important to note that, yeah, there was some attrition on the staff. In fact, Harbaugh had to replace both of his coordinators. He did not go outside for the replacement hire for Josh Gaddis. He promoted from within. Sharon Moore is the offensive line coach there, and Weiss is the quarterback coach. They've got one of the best offenses, and especially one of the quietly the best offenses in college football. It's just that you've got to throw the ball 50 times a game for your offense to get a ton of respect in this world, in the media world. But if you talk to staffs who will have to face Michigan this year, what worries them is Michigan's offense is going to do some stuff that you may not be able to stop even when you know it's coming. That's the scarier part. You know, if they just kind of paper cut you to death, that's one thing. But the paper cut and the tool that someone uses to paper cut you, if you get a hold of it, you know, you can just crumble it up. You can't crumble up a sledgehammer. And that's kind of what Michigan plans on throwing at you again this year. And if you stop it, they tip their cap to you. You're going to have to because you're not going to score a ton on them. And so they're just one of the more steady and dependable teams again this year. But if these two guys, if that offense ends up maybe even cranking it up, and I'm talking about cranking it up from an efficiency standpoint. I don't mean all of a sudden they reinvent who they are offensively. That would be stupid. There's no reason to do that. I know they've had their sessions with the media up there, and they've kind of talked about that, how we're not reinventing anything. Why would we? It works. Now, are there some things we're going to tinker with? Yeah, of course we want to evolve certain branches, but the tree is going to look like the tree's always looked under Jim Harbaugh. They have 2 quarterbacks that would start at most places. Ditto at running back, ditto at tight end. This is the deepest and most talented I've ever seen Michigan in the modern era, at least over the past 20 years at receiver. Offensive line, you know exactly what you're getting with them. It's going to be a really good offense. I think a really consistent offense. But if there's that little something extra, if there's that little, yards per pass bump up in metrics extra, if there's that little bit of a yards per carry bump up extra from them this year, if they can do a little more, if they're in a playoff scenario, or if they're on the road at Ohio State and they do need to score. Hey, they scored on them last year. But if they're in one of those kind of dogfight situations and they got that little bit extra, I know it seems like they were a long way away in the playoff last year. Get them to the playoff first. if they do have that little extra, they may be right back there again. I think that would surprise some people. I don't think it would surprise as many people in the Big Ten who have to game plan for them because they know what they're looking at. You know, you don't game plan based on headlines. You game plan based on the X's and O's, the guys you see on the field. The guys you see on the field from Michigan this year are still going to be really good. So those are some names to keep an eye on, and we will probably do that at least one more time.